Hello, I'm Shauna McGee, and I'm here to share more information about testing industry standards. If you've not watched my first video on testing standards yet, I recommend starting there. That video provides a broad overview of what testing standards are, why they matter, and what professional testing entities should be doing. It also explains my background and training in standardized assessment in case you would like more context on why I'm qualified to speak on this topic. Since that video was released, I've had several people reach out with follow-up questions, so I'm creating a short series of additional videos to help our interpreting community and deaf community better understand what we should reasonably expect from our testing systems. In this video, we're going to focus specifically on bias mitigation. Bias mitigation matters because tests can be unfair. If a test is written or scored in a way that favors one group of people over another, then it's not measuring skill. It's measuring privilege, culture, background, or access. That's how racism, xenophobia, and other bias can quietly get built into a testing system. And if bias is not actively removed, then people can fail not because they're not qualified, but because the test itself is flawed. That's why bias mitigation is not optional. It's a basic requirement for any test that claims to be valid, reliable, fair, and professional. Let's start with this. Simply having people of color in a test video is not bias mitigation. That's optics. Bias mitigation is not about appearances. It's about whether the testing system itself quietly advantages some people and disadvantages others, even when they're equally qualified. Let me show you what that actually means. Bias in testing does not mean some people fail. People failing is normal. Bias exists when a test disadvantages certain groups for reasons that have nothing to do with job performance. That disadvantage is not always intentional. Sometimes it is. And even when it starts unintentionally, it becomes intentional the moment a testing entity refuses to monitor outcomes, refuses to collect demographic data, and refuses to fix patterns that show harm. At that point, it is not an accident, it is a choice, and it is structural. Because if you're not looking for bias, you're allowing it. And that is not neutral. That is a decision to allow discrimination. Let me give you a general example. Think about a national driving test. If that test were designed mostly by people who learn to drive in New York City, it would heavily test parallel parking, dense traffic, one-way streets, pedestrians, and tight urban navigation. People who learned to drive in New York City would pass easily. People who learned to drive in rural areas or on highways might fail, not because they're unsafe drivers, but because the test was built around someone else's environment. That is bias, because the system centered one experience and treated it as universal. Bias mitigation begins with the job task analysis, or JTA. I'll discuss more in depth about the JTA requirements in the next video, but for now, here's a short explanation. The JTA tells us what interpreters across the country are actually doing and how often they are doing it. Not what one region does, not what one program teaches, not what a small group prefers. The JTA finds trends across interpreters from across the country. This matters because test content should reflect common practice across the field, not niche or regional norms. If test content does not align with JTA data, bias is already present before they develop the test. If the JTA is not distributed to a large representative sample of interpreters across the country, then it's not valid data and it cannot be used to define what normal practice is for the profession. So now we have the JTA data, and the next step is developing the test content and scripts. Bias mitigation continues when test items and scenarios are written. This means who writes the scripts matters, who reviews the scripts matters, and whose perspectives are included matters. Scripts must be reviewed for cultural assumptions, stereotyping, regional bias, language patterns that advantage one group over another, deaf community diversity, not just a single deaf experience. If one demographic group controls content development, bias is built in to advantage that demographic group before a candidate ever sits for the exam. Diversity in testing is not a political box check. It must reflect the actual demographics of the field as identified in the JTA. That includes race and ethnicity, geography, deaf and hearing interpreters, educational pathways, practice settings. Representation must be data-driven, not symbolic or based on feelings. If the field is diverse in specific ways, the testing system must mirror that diversity at every level. Anything else is misalignment. Bias does not stop at test materials. It also lives in how candidates are evaluated. This means that evaluators must be diverse. Evaluators must be trained on bias. Scoring criteria must be standardized and transparent. Inter-rater reliability must be continuously monitored. And this part is critical. Evaluator scores must be checked for patterns. If certain evaluators consistently score one group lower than others, that's not a difference of opinion. Evaluators must be held accountable through ongoing monitoring because bias is measurable and it shows up in scoring patterns, and it must be addressed. Bias mitigation does not end when the exam is administered. Testing entities must track outcome data. This includes pass and fail rates by race and ethnicity, comparison of BIPOC interpreter outcomes to white counterparts. An analysis of whether score differences reflect job performance or system bias. If this data is not collected, bias cannot be detected and remedied. If it is collected but not analyzed, bias is ignored and therefore allowed. So where is the data? Here is where accountability comes in. A legitimate testing entity does not just claim fairness, it publishes it. Who is involved in the test development? Who evaluates candidates? How bias is monitored? What outcome patterns look like at a high level? Not to shame anyone and not to expose individuals, but to allow the public and the profession to verify that bias mitigation is happening so that they can trust the test and the entity that administers it. Trust comes from verifiable data. Transparency itself is a bias mitigation tool. If a testing entity claims that their exam is fair, they should be able to prove it with data. That means they should be tracking pass and fail rates by race and ethnicity, pass and fail rates by deaf versus hearing candidates, pass and fail rates by region, pass and fail rates by educational pathway, and score patterns across different demographic groups. Because if one group consistently fails at a much higher rate, that is a red flag. They also need to track evaluator bias, including which evaluators score harsher than others, whether evaluators consistently score specific groups lower, and inter-rater reliability, meaning whether evaluators are scoring people consistently. If they're not tracking these patterns, then they have no way to know whether their test is fair. And if they're not measuring bias, they are not mitigating bias. And if they're not mitigating bias, they are allowing it. Bias mitigation is not something you do once. It is continuous. It requires regular statistical review, ongoing revision of test items, removal or rewriting of biased content, updating practices as the field evolves. A system that does not do this is not neutral. It is negligent. Let's be very clear. Bias mitigation is not putting a few Black or deaf people in test videos, or adding one diverse person to a committee, about making a public statement about equity, or asking people to trust intentions. Those are all performative gestures. Bias mitigation is built into data, process, oversight, transparency, and accountability. This matters because it affects who passes, who fails, who stays in the profession, and who gets excluded. A bias testing system does not just harm individuals. It shapes the profession itself. A biased test produces a biased profession. That is not accidental. That is a design failure. Under national testing standards used by organizations like the National Commission for Certifying Agencies, NCCA, and the Institute for Credentialing Excellence, ICE, bias mitigation is not optional and is not a one-time effort. It is required throughout the life of the exam. This means that test content must be reviewed for bias, evaluators must be monitored for scoring patterns, and test results must be analyzed to see how different groups perform. That analysis has to happen consistently, not once. If a pattern appears showing that one group is consistently disadvantaged in ways not related to job performance, the testing entity is required to investigate and correct the problem. Accreditation standards also expect enough transparency to show that this monitoring is actually happening. When outcome data is not tracked, reviewed, or used to make changes, the testing program is not meeting national standards for fairness. They have no way to ensure that the test is fair for everyone. A defensible testing system does not ask for trust. It earns it through data, through transparency, through independent and neutral third-party review, through continuous accountability. Bias mitigation is not about being nice. It's about being rigorous. And that's what protects deaf consumers, interpreters, and the profession as a whole. At the end of the day, interpreters are paying real money for these exams, and our careers depend on the results. So it is not unreasonable to expect transparency, data, and accountability from the systems that profit from our testing. If a testing entity cannot demonstrate that their exams are fair, valid, reliable, and actively monitored for bias, then the problem is not the candidates. The problem is the test, and no one should be required to fund a system that refuses to follow testing standards.